And we're on.
That's great, thank you. Welcome everyone to the Research Seminars in Islam and Christian Muslim Relations. This is a joint lecture with the ICMR seminars and my new course this semester, Gender in Islam. So a special shout out and welcome to all the undergraduate and postgraduate students in the course. And I'd like to thank the convener of the Semester 2 seminars, Dr. Salam Rassi, for very kindly rescheduling this seminar so that it aligns with the course. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Sophia Rahman from Leeds to talk about her exciting new book on the Prophet's wife, Aisha bint Abi Bakr. In terms of format, we're not going to have a conventional lecture, but instead we're going to have a conversation. So I'll be talking with Dr. Rahman about her book. We'll chat for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and discussion. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed guest. Dr. Sophia Rahman is an independent scholar specializing in Islam and gender. She works as a knowledge-building consultant for Musawa, which is a global women's organization committed to the reform of Muslim family law in line with gender egalitarian readings of Islam. She received her PhD in Islamic theology from the University of Leeds, where she was a PG Impact Fellow at the Center of Religion and Public Life. Dr. Rahman is the founder of the Islam and Gender Read-Alongs, in which she facilitates readings of academic texts penned by Muslim scholars in conversation with a global virtual audience. The read-alongs have recently been featured in Vogue Arabia, Refinery 29, and The Independent. Dr. Rahman is the author of the books Treasury of Aisha bint Abi Bakr, published by Cube, and the book we are going to discuss today, Gendering the Hadith, Recentering the Authority of Aisha, Mother of the Believers, which was published by Oxford University Press last month. Welcome, Dr. Rahman, to the University of Edinburgh Virtual.
Thank you, Shadab. Thank you for having me, and thanks to Dr. Rasi as well for helping us convene this session, and to all of your students who've taken the time out to be here today. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I'm glad that we decided to go with the format of it being a conversation, because I think that's just so much more engaging, and hopefully will encourage folk to get involved with the conversation afterwards as well.
Thank you for being here. We're delighted to have you. And before we talk about Aisha, let's talk a bit about the genre that you're engaging. What got you interested in the Hadith literature?
Yeah, so I think as a Muslim, it's quite impossible not to have an interest in the Hadith literature, especially given that so much of the interpretive tradition is, sort of buttressed by the Hadith, including how we read the Quran and how we make meaning of the Quran. And of course, how Islamic laws have been developed. So much of this is influenced by Hadith. So my first engagement with the Hadith was really, as a young teen trying to figure out Islam for myself. And, those were overwhelmingly pleasant experiences. My first experience of the Hadith were beautiful ones. I learned of a God that I was told loved me 70 times more than my mother did, who, if I took one step towards, would take 10 towards me. I learned of a prophet who was kind and gentle and merciful, who was known as Al-Amin, as-Sadiq, the truthful one, the trustworthy one, because of his honesty. A prophet who played with children and took time to sit with elderly women and listen to their thoughts, and indeed women of all ages, and hear out their complaints. A prophet who was forbearing with cruel neighbors. It was a pleasant first foray into the Hadith. But it wasn't long before this same sort of source of comfort and warmth, also became a means by which I felt myself being constricted. It was the Hadith tradition that was used time and again to, limit my movement or to shame me into silence. And as my network of Muslim women grew, whether that was through, friendships or whether that was through travel or through work, I just saw that it was very often the Hadith tradition that was weaponized in really egregious acts, you know, from things like FGM to subservience to husbands to, you know, assertions of a more sort of eschatological hue that, you know, women will make up the majority of the inhabitants of hell. And that too, because, you know, they were ungrateful to their husbands. It just didn't sit right. You know, I couldn't help but question how a religion that so fundamentally declares a, you know, sort of this full ontological equality of all before God, you know, regardless of gender, class, race, ability. We're told, you know, explicitly in the Quran that the only thing that differentiates, you know, humankind before God is their level of taqwa, is their level of God consciousness. So how does a religion like that then have such diminishing statements about women? And those diminishing statements are rooted in women's biology. You know, it didn't make sense to me. So for me, this, you know, sort of full ontological equality is so core. And especially this equality that is between men and women, found in the Quran in sort of multiple verses, but not least in its distinct creation story. You know, the creation story, which though it features Adam and Eve, you know, it doesn't necessarily name Eve, and even the term Adam is, it's sort of a, you know, contested. You know, is this the name of the individual? Was he Adam? Or is it just Adam to mean that, you know, one made of clay? You know, is it just a descriptor of that first human creation? Nonetheless, the Quranic creation story doesn't speak of, for want of a better expression, Eve as a derivative of Adam. She's not made out of the rib of Adam, but rather the Quran speaks of their creation as a moment of co-creation of two selves, or a soul split from one. Two souls split from one. That there was nafsun wahida, that there was one spirit, one soul that Allah creates, and then from that soul, two are created, two are made by the splitting of this one. And you know, the scholar Rifat Hassan, she's done a brilliant exegesis of the Quranic creation story, and she highlights the, you know, sort of important differences between the Quranic and biblical narratives. And we have to ask ourselves, if the Quran has retold a story, and it has told that story with significant and specific differences, then we should be curious about those differences rather than do what actually happened, which was that through the classical exegesis of the Quran, through the tafsir of the Quran, the biblical narrative is reinserted. And that too, using the Hadith to validate this. And that's just one example. At the same time, it is through the Hadith that, you know, certain practices that not only protect but also elevate women are established. So the Hadith play this, you know, really vital role in the development of Muslim praxis, which can, you know, as we see, be patriarchal. But the Hadith can also be used to develop egalitarian and gender just ways of developing Muslim praxis. So, you know, why not is my question. So I began my graduate journey out as, and I hope that none of your undergraduates, you know, relate to this, but I started my undergraduate journey as a miserable and agonized business and economics undergrad. But I, you know, took up Arabic as part of my degree. And then once I graduated, I traveled to Syria to study more traditionally at Abu Nur with private teachers. Then I moved to an institute in Wales, and I know that Wales is not often associated with centers of traditional Islamic learning, but I did. And then I moved to Istanbul in Turkey, where I studied again with private teachers. So then it was a few years later when my youngest child started school that, you know, I decided, okay, I'm going to go back into academia, get onto my master's in Middle Eastern and Islamic studies, and then move on to my PhD. Now, it was through this through going back to academia, that one of the greatest challenges for me was presented, and that was actually reading the works of Muslim feminist scholars like, Amina Wadood, Asma Barlas, Ziba Mir Hosseini, who I'm sure are names that are familiar to many in this group right now. So whilst on the one hand, I had intuited that there was a rupture between the just God that I found in Islam and the assertion of unjust practices that were allegedly upheld by Islam, according to many Muslims. I was also not quite ready for the radical rereadings that these scholars provided. Unlearning is perhaps harder than learning, and we all in this room appreciate how hard learning can be. So, unlearning is, I feel, an even more rigorous process to go through. But once I found myself open up to more Muslim feminist works, I found their work primarily focused on the Quran. And this, of course, makes absolute sense, given that, the Quran is, it is agreed to amongst Muslims as the word of God. It has an undisputed status amongst Muslims. And of course, also, it's just very neatly codified in a single agreed upon text. Whereas the Hadith, on the other hand, I found the Hadith were treated in sort of one of three ways. They were either just disregarded altogether, and in some instances, even with almost a disdain towards them, or they were just conveniently ignored, or they were only engaged with in sort of an atomistic way, a hadith here and a hadith there, probing a particular tradition, but not necessarily, there wasn't yet a study that explored or offered a systematic approach to, reading the prophetic tradition in a way that aligned with the egalitarian impulse of the Quran, which was very well established, particularly by, liberation theologians and amongst them Muslim feminists. So it was this gap in the work of Muslim feminist scholars, which, I then sought to address through my own scholarship.
Thank you for that. That's a key theme that we've touched on in the course, how first generation Islamic feminists focused heavily on the Quran, and there was this, at best, skepticism, at worst, maybe even antagonism towards the Hadith literature. And one of the reasons that they would often bring up is that there is that question of authenticity, right? So if there is contestation over whether a Hadith is actually a faithful rendition of what the Prophet said or what the Prophet did or what the Prophet saw and then validated, why is it still important, in your opinion, to engage this body of literature when we don't have a similar dynamic of authenticity around the Quran per se?
I think that's such a great question. And, before I go to the question, you raised something about antagonism with the Hadith. And it's not just antagonism that I found with the Hadith, but there was also a sense of antagonism with individual narrators of Hadith. And whilst I do build, and we will discuss this, I do build on the works of previous scholars. Of course, I'm indebted to their work. And even amongst those scholars, there was a sense of antagonism towards particular individuals. That was also something that I do revisit in my book. I don't spend a lot of time on it, but I argue that, well, maybe those individuals where we find a lot of antagonism. So I'll just name him. Abu Huraira is an individual that comes up very often as problematic, and he has an entire chapter in my book dedicated to him for that very reason. But he's often sort of being portrayed as this irritation, this, misogynist who had an unhealthy love of cats and never got married. He was the original Catwoman, but a man. I sort of play with that a little bit, and I asked the question that, could we not reframe Aisha's constant correction of him as actually a friendship? Who do you get to correct in the way that she does with him? And he responds as well. He can push back. Maybe that is indicative of a very strong relationship. There are other instances where she corroborates what he says and she takes his narration of a statement over that of somebody else. And that sort of seemed to have gotten lost in previous conversations about Abu Huraira. So even where there were conversations about particular companions of the Prophet, and where they were portrayed as being problematic in a particular kind of way, or seen as antagonized in a particular way. Even with that, I present a possibility that maybe even those things we could look at in a different light. That if there is difference, or if there is disputation, it doesn't mean that there has to be antagonism there as well. I mean, I think one of the things that really creates some of the best scholarship that we have is where we have been in disputation with somebody else, where we've taken somebody else's work or been in conversation with somebody and ended up in a dispute, or we've been in an argument with them. Argument can be generative, and it can be positive as well, and it can be done, and it's best done actually when it is done within an environment that is actually loving and respectful and caring, even if sometimes it descends into the odd dig at each other. But to go back to the question, Shadab, that you asked about the authenticity of the hadith and sort of the contestation around the authenticity of hadith. It's true, whilst the authenticity or status of some hadith, may be questioned and have been questioned, the hadith tradition as a whole has had it's had immense scholarly effort poured into it over the centuries. And as I write in my book, the problem of hadith authenticity is one that has always been recognized by Muslims. And it is because of this awareness that there was a great deal of effort put into creating an entire science around the hadith. We have the ulum al-hadith, the sciences of the hadith, by which to measure the likelihood of authenticity, which included interrogating the isnad, the chain of narration. It included developing criteria by which to assess the validity of that chain, but also the matan, the content of the hadith. So then by the 10th century, sort of, the 4th century of the Islamic calendar, you have a whole science of hadith established, and it has within it genres such as ilm al-rijal, the science, of studying individual narrators of hadith, looking at them and scrutinizing who they are. And it's during this time, it's by the 11th century, that 6 canonical collections of hadith emerge, and they're sort of accepted as canonical amongst Sunni Muslims. And whilst they emerge as the authoritative 6, they don't entirely preclude other collections which also applied rigor to their chains and statements. So one such text, which sat outside the canonical 6, but was constituted of strongly authenticated hadith, was the 14th century text Al-Ijaba li-iradi ma istadraktahu Aisha ala Sahaba, the corrective, Aisha's rectification of the companions, which is the focal point in my own book, and we can return to that later. But ultimately, the hadith tradition for me presents a really exciting and still quite malleable area of research. It holds an authority in the global Muslim community. Therefore, it warrants study, especially when there have been scholarly efforts in safeguarding, the valid traditions and rooting out the fabrications. It provides, an existing framework for investigating the hadith, which can be built upon, which is exactly what I did using the insights I found in how Aisha bint Abi Bakr went about impugning or validating her peers and their statements, which they were attributing to her husband, the Prophet Muhammad.
Thank you for that. Before jumping into the life of Aisha, I wanted to push you a bit more on your formation as a scholar. So when you were talking about Quranic exegesis, you mentioned a number of pioneering figures, Amni Wadud, Rifat Hassan, Asma Barlas. When it comes to Hadith studies, is there a particular scholar that has had a lasting impact on your own development?
Yeah. So I think there are many scholars of Islam who sort of paved the way towards this, such as Fazlur Rahman, Hashim Kamali, Muhammad Zubair Siddiqui. They've all written on Hadith. They've written on the importance of engaging the Hadith uh, and been influential in how I have approached the prophetic tradition. But Shadab, you've read the book, so as you'll have seen in my book, my work very much builds upon the pathway in scholarship that was opened up by Fatima Mernissi. So Fatima Mernissi, as some of you may know, was a Moroccan scholar who, is without doubt one of the godmothers of the Islamic feminist movement. And I think that, while I will focus on her approach to the Hadith, I think she was also refreshing as somebody who just wrote very beautifully. She was the first sort of academic that I engaged with where I realized that, oh, you can write beautifully and in a way that's engaging and in a way that welcomes readers in. I just remember being so moved by her writing. It was very emotive as well. But the first book I read by her was The Veil and the Male Elite. And it was the first time, remember I was talking about unlearning and how difficult that was? Well, this was the first time I felt really challenged in my understanding of the Hadith tradition. It was the first time I saw the prophetic tradition treated in the way that she treated it. Firstly, she historicized the statements she looked at, rather than stripping them of vital context. And in reinstating the contexts of traditions and when and how they were first presented, she shed an entirely new light on them. In many ways, she demystified them, and some would say she desacralized them. And I see nothing wrong in that. The Hadith were never meant to be sacred in the way that the Quran is sacred. The Quran for Muslims is the undisputed, indisputed word of God. And there is a promise within the Quran that Allah will protect the Quran. There is no such guarantee for the prophetic tradition. So, because of its nature of being possibly infiltrated by fabrications, it has to be treated as something that is not sacred. That is how it should be treated. And that's how then we can actually mine it for its authentic statements. So an example is sort of where she provides historical context to the supposed prophetic tradition, where the Prophet Muhammad is alleged to have said that, any nation that is ruled or led by a woman is just doomed to failure. Incidentally, I remember, I was a child, but I have recollections of when Benazir Bhutto was first elected as the first ever female prime minister of Pakistan. And this was the thing, this was the weapon that was used against her, very often by her detractors. Well, we're a Muslim country, and the Prophet has said that any nation led by a woman is doomed to failure. And she had to write a whole she's written a whole article on this. But that's just one instance in which this particularly problematic tradition has been weaponized against women. But what Mernissi shows is that this statement didn't actually arise until well after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. It was actually at the start of the reign of the fourth Caliph, Ali. So Aisha had opposed Ali's selection as Caliph, but also what she saw as his mishandling of bringing to justice the murderers of the previous Caliph, Uthman. So then this then led to the two parties, Aisha and Ali, raising an army each and going to battle. And this battle comes to be known as the Battle of the Camel, because Aisha enters into the foray on the back of a camel. But anyway, ultimately Aisha lost. She doesn't win this battle. But during this whole episode, there's a man by the name of Abu Bakr, who's not to be confused with Aisha's father, Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr, is captured by Ali's men for having taken Aisha's side. And it is at this opportune moment that Abu Bakr suddenly remembers this so-called hadith that no nation is ruled by a woman except that it is doomed to destruction, hoping perhaps for leniency in having conveniently had this recollection. So, not satisfied at simply interrogating the context in which this misogynistic tradition was singularly transmitted, Fatima Mernissi also then investigates the legitimacy of this Abu Bakr as an authority to even be narrating hadith in the first place. And it turns out that he had been flogged previously for false testimony, by Umar, the second caliph of Islam. And this automatically would have made him, by the criteria established by the science of hadith, an unreliable source for hadith narration. But expedience meant that both his history and the criteria set in place by scholars of hadith had been overlooked. And that was just one instance of sort of, mind blown whilst reading Mernissi's work. And it is in this same book that, in the Veil and the Male Elites, that she also presented two incidents in which Aisha was correcting Abu Huraira, who I mentioned earlier. So essentially, Mernissi dared to enter the world of hadith scholarship and see for herself how sound the arguments against her full agency and actualization that were made through supposed prophetic tradition actually were. And I found that she found that they just simply rang hollow. So this engagement with the hadith, it was radical and liberating, yet also I found within it a greater sense of upholding what the classical scholars of hadith, who had exerted all this energy in developing tools for safeguarding the hadith tradition. This is what they had hoped to achieve. A consistent and continual generation to generation alertness and engagement with the prophetic tradition, so as to ensure that it would not undermine the mission of Muhammad nor the Quran. So Mernissi really paved a way.
I think that example of Abu Bakr and his vilification of Aisha and her leadership is such a great example, and I think it's a very useful bridge into the next part of our conversation, which is all about the protagonist of your book, Aisha bint Abi Bakr. Who is this remarkable woman, and what is her relationship to the Hadith literature?
So Aisha was an astute and intelligent woman, affirmed by many as the first scholar of Islam. She was an authoritative figure whose words continue to this day to hold incredible power. She was politically engaged and had been an advisor to both the first Caliph of Islam, her father, Abu Bakr, and the second Caliph of Islam, Umar ibn al-Khattab, sort of informally. And then it was in the reign of the third Caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, when he came to power and was accused of nepotism, sort of giving positions of authority and power to people within his own tribe or her family. It was then that her political engagement really came to the fore. Her home became a center for gathering and dissent to hold the Caliph accountable. And there were times when Uthman would be on the mimbar, giving, addressing his people, and Aisha would stand up and hold him accountable and tell him that he was wrong. To the point where one day he gets irritated and says, weren't you ordered to stay at home? Weren't you ordered to just remain in the confines of the privacy of your home? And this dissent, really grew until it started to fester, actually. It turns. And Uthman was then tragically murdered. And as we've already established, Ali was then appointed caliph. And, Aisha was dissatisfied. She was dissatisfied at the appointment of Ali as caliph. And then she was also disappointed at his response to bringing the murderers of Uthman to justice. And her resistance then led her to challenge him, Ali, by raising an army and meeting him in Baghdad. So she is recognized as a jurist, as a faqihah, and an authority on the prophetic tradition. She is one about whom verses of the Quran were revealed to exonerate her from the slander that was spread about her regarding her fidelity as a young woman. She was also the third and most beloved wife of the Prophet Muhammad. And I put that last because although it's unlikely we would have come to know of her in the way that we do if she hadn't been the Prophet's wife, I also believe that given the nature of her character, that she was always destined to make her mark in history. So that's why I state her being the wife of the Prophet last. And she is beloved to Sunni Muslims, whilst treated with some suspicion by Shia Muslims. She's both revered as a mother of the believers, but also one who was caught in a number of scandals, not only in her life, but beyond too, due to sort of the intra-Muslim disputes and interfaith polemics. But having spent most of her life in the orbit of the Prophet and having had intimate insight into his life, she was in a privileged position in terms of her knowledge amongst the wives of Muhammad, who were made responsible by God in the Quran to uphold and continue the prophetic legacy. They were addressed directly by God, who says to them, remember, wadhkurna, and proclaim what is recited in your homes of God's revelations and wisdom, for God is most subtle, all aware. And that's Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 34. So where God themselves is directly addressing the women folk of the Prophet ﷺ and telling them, you are responsible. This is a responsibility that is being passed on to you, to proclaim what is recited in your homes. Because what is, who has greater and more insight of what goes on in a home than the inhabitants of that home? And this prophetic mantle appears to have landed most firmly, I would argue, with Aisha. In my book, I argue that the challenge to the claimed rigidity of how we read sacred texts, in particular the Hadith, is disrupted by the ways in which actually key moments in the life of Aisha have been repeatedly revised by scholars in response to demands on the texts from Muslims and non-Muslims alike. So I map out in the book how three moments, there were these three sort of momentous moments, in fact, in Aisha's life, that we see, if we look at the historicity of those three events, we see how malleable they've actually been. So these three events that I outline and explain in the book are her age upon marriage, the incident of the slander that took place in Medina at the time, during the lifetime of the Prophet. And the third is the time that she fought Ali, the Battle of the Camel, which I've also commented on already. Each one of these has been retold in varying hues throughout history, just depending on what the demands of the day are. And I also deconstruct these incidents in her life to seek out the traces or the glimmers of Aisha's character, despite, the retellings. And I find in there, a woman who was inquisitive, who was critical, who was eloquent, who was deeply reliant and trusting in God, who was courageous in upholding what she saw as the truth, and was uncompromising in her adherence to justice always. Someone who was spiritually grounded and politically savvy. And I used this insight into her character as well as, a consideration when translating the text of Al-Ijaba. And what I found interesting in writing this part about her was how much in contrast she stood to what the paragon of female Muslim piety is asserted as being in normative contemporary Islam, where the Muslim women, where the contemporary Muslim woman is encouraged to be demure, obliging, patient, quiet, obedient. We find in the tradition Aisha, who is rebellious, independent, insubordinate, while still also being deeply pious, who finds her agency in her relationship to God and her authority in her knowledge of the Prophet. So she provides thereby an alternative for Muslim women for how they can be faithful women who are also engaged in public life, who raise their voices whenever they feel moved to do so. Imam al-Tabari describes Aisha during her expedition to Baghdad to meet Ali in war. On this journey, she stops and makes public speeches, trying to garner the support of others. And she's described as a Jalila, which was understood to mean a woman of high rank, who was eloquent in her speech and who could be heard from a distance. Mm-hmm. And I find that interesting, firstly, because Aisha is described as such, but secondly, that this was a descriptor that was already in place and people understood it for what it meant, which meant that there were other women like this too. So this is who Aisha is.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. You focus on Aisha, but you also focus on a particular text in your book, and that is Imam Badr ad-Din az-Zarkashi's The Corrective, Al-Ijaba, Aisha's rectification of the companions. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular text and why it's important for your study?
Yeah, absolutely. So Al-Ijaba was penned, as I said earlier, in the 14th century by the renowned scholar Imam Badr ad-Din az-Zarkashi. And az-Zarkashi was thought to have written anything between 33 and 46 works. And I think by today's standards, we'd call him a polymath. He wrote on a range of topics from jurisprudence to sciences of the Quran, principles of jurisprudence, exegesis, and much, much more. And Al-Ijaba was actually amongst his final works. And it's clear that of all of his many, many texts, he held Al-Ijaba in a high regard. He had dedicated this text to the Qadi al-Qudat of his time, the chief judge, who was Qadi Burhan ad-Din ibn Jama'ah, who came from this illustrious family, who had a long history of judicial authority. And, to me, the fact that he had dedicated, that Imam az-Zarkashi had dedicated Al-Ijaba to, the Qadi al-Qudat, it kind of indicates his desire for the text to influence the highest authority in the prevailing religio-legal system. He had aspirations for this book. And in another of his works, Imam Zarkashi says of Al-Ijaba that he had sought to clarify that which is obscure, to make manifest that which is hidden. It's also recorded that on his deathbed, Imam Zarkashi gathered all his children, his sons and daughters. He had 2 sons and 2 daughters. And he'd had them revise all of his texts, but it was Al-Ijaba that he had recite twice. And despite his aspirations for this text, it was, in fact, actually almost entirely lost to us. I write in my book that somehow, by a tenacity and resilience that is emblematic of its core protagonist, Aisha, it survives, almost willing its own discovery. So only 2 manuscripts are known to exist on Al-Ijaba, and both appear to have accidentally have been sort of perchanced upon. So first is in 1939 by Saeed al-Afghani, and that was in the Zahiriya library in Damascus. And then in 1994 by Mehmet Bunyamin Arul at the Beyazid Library of Istanbul. But once again, even despite the enthusiasm and excitement with which both of these men recall finding their respective manuscripts, nothing more than sort of a print edition in Arabic and a Turkish translation were generated from this find. And in this text, Az-Zarkashi records over 200 statements in which Aisha is correcting or refuting and at times corroborating statements of almost invariably male companions. And these statements are chapterized by Zarkashi according to who Aisha is refuting, sort of reinforcing in the structure of the book as well as its content Aisha's authority amongst her peers. Zarkashi prefaces the 220 statements of Aisha with an enumeration of 42 qualities that are unique to Aisha, sort of thereby combining her unique virtues with her unique contributions to Islamic tradition. And I think this is important because this was done at a time when Aisha's memory was being reduced to a sanitized, pedestalized, ideal Muslim woman whose virtues were in her virginity at the time of marriage or in her being presented in a dream, wrapped up in silk to the Prophet as an indication that he should marry her, or in the committed loving role that she played as a wife, all of which are true. But Az-Zarkashi sought to attach to those virtues by which she was, by his time almost singularly being remembered by. He's attaching to those virtues her scholarly and intellectual virtues, thus elevating her status once more as a religious authority in her own right, not only the wife, the loving, caring, dutiful wife of the Prophet Muhammad. So to be clear, the importance of this text, are many. Firstly, it is a compilation of sound hadith, all proven to meet the highest criteria of authenticity in the hadith tradition. But many of these statements which Zarkashi collected in this book were not recorded in the 6 canonical hadith books. So it resists, in its being, it's sort of resisting the foreclosure of authentic hadith which reside outside the canon. It's possible, it's plausible that by the 14th century, Zarkashi could see this sort of narrowing of the hadith tradition to those 6 texts, which threatened the authentic hadith that stood outside of those 6 canonical texts. And many of these hadith, as Zarkashi proves in those that he's collected, are those of Aisha's, Secondly, it represents Aisha as more than just this quiet, pious paragon and reminds us of her intellectual authority. Thirdly, it allows us to question why there have been a number of instances where her correction or position has not been taken up as the legal position on a given matter, and instead the position of another less learned, usually male companion, has, even when her statements can be proven to be just as authentic as those relaying an alternative opinion. And leading on from this, the 4th point is that it allows us to investigate the means by which she corrects the companions. What is the criteria, even if sort of informally in her mind, that she is using to correct these companions? And from that, we can, and this is what I do in my book, is extract an emergent methodology. And again, we can circle back to this. And finally, there is actually one outlier in Al-Ijaba, and that is the single instance in which Aisha is responding to a female companion. She's responding to Fatima bint Qais. And this instance is a breakaway from the others, in that it is a response to, a female companion, but also it's not a refutation, and nor is it it's not an impugnment of Fatima as a narrator of hadith either. Aisha is very gentle and thoughtful in her response to Fatima. She validates her statement. The issue that Fatima raises is about divorce, and she raises it on the basis of her own experience. And Aisha is very thoughtful and mindful in how she responds to Fatima, acknowledging the pain of Fatima's experience during her divorce, but also highlighting that Fatima's experience was exceptional and not one that provides a norm to follow, which was what Fatima was asserting. And I argue that Aisha demonstrates in many of her correctives, but especially in her response to Fatima, an ethic of care in handling of Fatima's sensitive situation. So the text is, I share the excitement of Al-Afghani and Arul in the discovery of this text, but sort of just making it available as a print edition or as a translation in Turkish just wasn't enough for me.
And that's one of the great contributions of your book is that, in the book, I've had the pleasure to read this extraordinary book. And just at the very end, there's an appendix in which Dr. Rahman actually provides a select translation of various parts of Al-Ijaba, the corrective. So that's the first time, right, that this is actually appearing in English then?
That's right, yeah. And I mean, my hope is to eventually get the whole text translated. I mean, I only focus on the hadith aspect, but as I mentioned earlier, Imam Zarkashi gives us 40 virtues of Aisha's, and I think that those would be great to put out into the public domain as well. So let's see, hopefully we can get a translation of the whole text done at some point too.
Yeah, that would be a really nice feminist counterpart to like Imam an-Nawawi's 40 hadith. So I think that
Yeah.
would be really cool. So Aisha is there and she is correcting men who are misquoting the Prophet. Could you give us two concrete examples of how that works out?
Yeah, so whenever I'm asked to give examples, I always feel really spoilt for choice, like a child in a sweetie shop. But uh, I mentioned earlier instances where a less authoritative male companion's position has been preferred over Aisha's by various scholars, even though she is the more knowledgeable individual and the narration of her statements are just as strong. So I'll begin with an example of that. So Imam al-Zarkashi states that Aisha was informed that Abu Sa'id al-Khudri said, "The Messenger of God forbids a woman from traveling unless she is accompanied by a mahram." So a mahram is like a male guardian who's related to the woman. And he goes on, he says, Amra said, Aisha then turned to the womenfolk and said, "Not all of you has a mahram." This statement of Aisha's always really endears her to me. I imagine her sitting amongst a group of women, and then she's told of this statement being made in her husband's name, restricting women's movement. And instead of engaging the one who relayed the statement or who's made the statement in the first place, or sort of entering into a polemic about the rights and wrongs of that assertion, she actually just turns to her audience, the very women who will be affected by this statement in a provocation, and this is a pedagogical approach, that I see Aisha enact numerous times. She puts the problem to those who will be worst hit to rise up, to not just accept that difficulties are as par for the course of being a good Muslim woman, that you should just be patient and forbearing. Instead, she's inciting them to speak up, to say no to authority when it is behaving unjustly. So sadly, even as Zarkashi tries to argue that in fact Aisha was validating what Abu Sa'id al-Khudri had said, that she was repeating it as an emphasis for the women, but this is unlikely, particularly because she is known to have traveled without a male guardian and makes no apologies for it. She is known to have gone on Hajj, to have gone on Umrah. She lived in Medina, but she was traveling to Mecca. She goes to Baghdad. She doesn't justify that in any way. So, I love this image of Aisha turning to the women folk and saying, think about this. Think about what has just been put to you. Think about the difficulties this will set up for you. Not all of you has a male companion or a male guardian, a male relative. Maybe you do, but they're not capable of going with you to every trip that you want to make, travel with you to every destination you want to go to. Maybe she has family in a different town or city, and requiring a mahram will make it difficult for her to make that journey to visit her family. Aisha gave the women an opportunity to critically think about what was being said to them. And my second example has to be one where she is refuting the verbose Abu Huraira. And in this one, Az-Zarkashi states that the Messenger of Allah said, and this is according to Abu Huraira, that bad luck is found in three things: the house, the woman, and the horse. So Aisha responded, Abu Huraira has not remembered. He entered upon the Messenger of Allah as he was saying, may Allah curse those who say bad luck is found in three things: the house, the woman, and the horse. He heard the last part of the statement, but not the first. And Az-Zarkashi further supports Aisha's stance by citing another narration in which it is said that when Aisha hears this, Aisha became visibly enraged and said, by the one who revealed the Quran upon Abu al-Qasim, he never said such a thing, but rather the Prophet of Allah would say, the people of ignorance used to say, calamity lies in the woman, riding beast, and home. And then she recited from the Quran, Surah Al-Hadid, verse 22, no calamity can ever befall the earth, and neither your own selves, unless it be laid down in our decree before we bring it into being. Verily, everything is easy for God. So in the first statement, she gives Abu Huraira the excuse of not having heard correctly, whilst in the second statement offered by Az-Zarkashi, she doesn't offer him that grace, but corrects the statement by completing it, but then also offers up a verse of the Quran that rejects such superstition, which in lieu of having their full hadith, should have been enough cause for Abu Huraira and others to have known there was a deficiency in that narration. Either there was information missing or it was a fabrication. So for Aisha, and we see this, the Quran is a touchstone. It is the criterion by which the hadith are to be measured. And I think these two hadith, are good examples of that.
Well, speaking about touchstones and the Hadith's relationship to the Quran and criteria and measures, I want to end this series of questions by going back to the question of methodology. In your book, you talk about a particular type of methodology that Aisha can offer us as scholars of Hadith. What can we learn from Aisha in terms of interpreting the Hadith?
Yeah, so in my analysis of the statements of Aisha in response to her peers, I do extract an emergent methodology of Aisha on how to approach the hadith. I don't make the argument that this was her, conscious methodology, but that when we study, over 200 statements of hers, it is possible to start to hypothesize about a methodology. So there are sort of four main strategies or strands to this methodology. The first is measuring the hadith traditions against the Quran. Now, Aisha is seen repeatedly responding to companions, citing the Quran as evidence against the veracity or accuracy of what they have stated. And I've given you an example in her response to Abu Huraira's superstitious statement. But she's actually found to even have done this with the Prophet himself too. She would question his statements against what she knew of the Quran until she was satisfied with his explanation. And we know from the prophetic tradition, in fact, that this behavior of hers is one of the endearing traits of hers to the Prophet Muhammad. You know, the Prophet is known to have one day been so overjoyed by her inquisitive nature and in her sort of consistently holding him to account by what she knew of the Quran that he makes this beautiful dua for her. And I speak about this in my other book, actually, which is A Treasury of Aisha. And it's just a really beautiful, intimate image that emerges of Aisha sitting with the Prophet, and he's sitting on the floor cross-legged, and she's got her head in his lap, and she's, you know, been disputing with him about what he's been saying against her knowledge of the Quran. And he loves this, and he starts to make a dua for her, asking Allah to forgive all of her misgivings and her sins, those that she's done knowingly and unknowingly, and those that she's done already, and those that she will do in the future. And she's just so overjoyed by this dua, this supplication that he makes for her, that she starts laughing, and you know, sort of her head falls off his lap from laughter, because she's just so overjoyed. And I love this image of this you know, loving and caring and jovial relationship between the Prophet Muhammad and Aisha, you know, which is not necessarily the way in you know, the ways in which Muslim marriage is necessarily presented, the ideal for Muslim marriage either. But I digress. Another example that I give of this in my book, you know, where Aisha is holding the Prophet accountable, or questioning him rather, against her own knowledge of the Quran, is an instance when Aisha said that once the Prophet said, "Whoever will be called to account about his or her deeds on the day of resurrection will surely be punished." And Aisha says, "I said, but wait, doesn't Allah say he surely will receive an easy reckoning?" And the Prophet replied, "This means only the presentation of the accounts, but whoever will be argued against about his account will certainly be ruined." So for Aisha, the Quran is the first port of call, and that is what she encourages the Muslim community to do too. If we know that something is established in the Quran and we find a hadith that speaks counter to that, even if others have validated it, authenticated it, argued for its strength, she argues for its dismissal, essentially. Number two is measuring hadith traditions against the prophetic practice or the sunnah and other prophetic traditions that were known to Aisha. So, you know, sometimes you would have two traditions come along and they may be in conflict to one another. And again, as my example of Abu Huraira's hadith illustrates, you know, Aisha in the first narration was able to correct him by referring to her own knowledge of the Prophet's practice. And this particular method means that not all companions can be considered equal, which is how hadith scholars have treated the generation of companions previously. So whilst there's always been a strong interrogation of each individual in the chain of narration, all the way up to the Prophet, it is that station at the top, that level at the top, you know, the generation of the companions where that scrutiny is not as carefully applied. And that's what has made it possible to choose a less favorable statement from a less authoritative individual, simply because the whole generation of companions of the Prophet had been deemed equally reliable. Even though it is clear that, you know, this is actually an untenable position. Aisha, who has spent almost her whole life around the Prophet, first as the daughter of Abu Bakr, one of the earliest converts to Islam, then later as Muhammad's wife, cannot then be compared in terms of her knowledge and insight to someone like Abu Huraira, who at most will only have spent about 3 or 4 years with the Prophet. And those two, you know, were his final years. So essentially missing out on some of the really key events in the life of the early Muslims, you know, some of the key battles or the boycott that they experienced or the expulsion or the migration. You know, Abu Huraira didn't see any of those events occur. So how then can his understanding of the knowledge be compared or be comparable to that of Aisha, whose father converts to Islam while she's only 9 years old? It just doesn't make sense. So the third strand is measuring the hadith traditions against her own intellect. We see this in the first example that I gave, wherein it was asserted that, women could not travel without a male guardian. Aisha exposes the problem of that stance by provoking the women in her company. Not all of you has a male guardian, implying what then? A woman may not have a male family member who can accompany her on her travels for a number of reasons, or she may be a single woman living on her own. To accept the imposition with no consideration of the implications of a prohibition that seems to have no support from the Quran, nor other binding prophetic statements to support it, to just accept that without critical engagement, is really to waste the very quality that is supposed to distinguish humankind from beasts, which is our intellect. And the fourth and final strand of the emergent methodology of Aisha is upholding an ethic of care towards the Muslim community. So in my book, I argue that a perhaps more discreet approach is emerging in Aisha's practice, and that is an ethic of care towards the burgeoning Muslim community, especially towards its female members. So in an ethic of care, the individual is seen as belonging to networks of relationships and are considered an important touchstone in problem solving. So we see not just the individual, but we see the network of relationships that they're part of. The world is seen as a complex network of relationships between individuals rather than just a system of rules, principles, competing rights, and hierarchical ideals based around the individual. And this mirrors closely the Quranic conceptualization of the Ummah, the global Muslim community forged on the foundations of religious belief and communal connection, which is required to operate not only on the basis of what is good and right for the individual, but also to consider the impact it has on the community, starting from those closest in proximity to us. So, for example, the family, and then the neighborhood, and so on. So these are the 4 key elements of the emergent methodology that I extract from these 220 statements of Aisha's as patterns that repeat again and again in her own approach to the hadith. And to apply this emergent methodology, could hold, and of course it goes outside of the remit of what I could cover in my own work here, but I think that there's follow-up research to be done here. If we apply this emergent methodology, it could hold significant implications, not only for the science of hadith, but for other branches of knowledge like Islamic jurisprudence or exegesis of the Quran. It's very exciting.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Rahman. This is a fascinating discussion, an absolutely fascinating book. Could I ask you to end this session by doing a book reading? Is there a particular excerpt that you would like to read?
Yes. So I thought I'd go to the end actually, which is maybe not, it's not where we start, but in my conclusion, I talk about the past and the present. I talk about, here is everything that has gone before, and here we are now. And then I talk about the future. And I just wanted to read the bit about the future because I feel like that's sort of where we've arrived at in this conversation. We've touched on the historicity of Aisha herself, her stories. We've talked about her interventions in the hadith. So I guess really I want to talk about where we go from here. So I write, by virtue of this study, several pathways for future research are opened up. I have attempted to extract an emergent methodology of Aisha's in approaching traditions. It would be interesting to see how this could be further developed and how this would affect the hadith collections if applied to them, and the consequential impact that they may have on other sciences, such as jurisprudence and exegesis of the Quran. Future research could benefit from considering traditions of Aisha outside of the canonized corpus, especially outside of the Sahihs of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, which remains Shafi'i-centric, to examine those traditions considered sound and accepted by the other major Muslim schools of thought. This would further aid in the exploration of Aisha as a defender of prophetic legacy and in the endeavor to strengthen the position of her correctives and in the potential discovery of more. Whilst I have presented two emergent methodologies for the scrutiny of Hadith and the derivation of Islamic law, both of these could also be further developed with the aid of exploring traditions outside of Al-Ijaba. I have shown that the positions of Aisha have been tragically dulled through the canonization process, but not entirely obscured from the historical record. The implementation of a jarh wa ta'dil on the companions, so that's validation and impugnment, on the companions would help to better resolve the issue of conflicting statements. In addition to this, the emergent methodology of Aisha to check a tradition against the lived experience of more senior companions, to measure statements up against those of the Quran and other hadith, to be able to contextualize statements and to engage the intellect in a process of ijtihad when considering a tradition is crucial for approaching the hadith corpus in a manner that would render the tradition more authentic and possibly less exposed to manipulation or inaccurate assertions. I have argued that the generation of the companions of the Prophet has taken on an almost prophetic status of its own. It is a generation that is not subject to scrutiny. This scenario has evolved as a result of intra-Muslim conflict and partisanship that emanated from it. Opening the companions to scrutiny is perhaps the most radical proposal of this study. Aisha took into consideration the implications of statements on the lives of a marginalized segment of society, women, and sought to do so through what would now be called an ethic of care. She set the standard for such scrutiny and is exemplary in how to pursue this role further, which could aid in reinvigorating and reshaping the Hadith tradition. Similarly, her approach to Islamic law depicts a commitment to the Quran and prophetic tradition, but also to an outcome that provides the most optimum results for the community of believers. The excavation of Aisha's scholarly voice and the elevation of her status on the grounds of her contribution to the very production of knowledge in Islam, rather than simply in her being the only virgin bride or shown to the Prophet in a dream wrapped in silk and indicated for marriage, calls for a reimagining and realigning of the Muslim imaginary too. An imaginary in which Muslim women can and do hold their male counterparts and those in authority to account, and that their account is taken to hold equal validity, where Muslim women can deign to take on roles that have no precedent in the community because precedent is not incumbent in order for it to be a possibility, where Muslim women contribute to knowledge generation and production and not just the relaying and transmitting of patriarchy-approved interpretations of the faith. A Muslim imaginary that can consider Muslim women's lived experiences as sound and normative considerations in the development of Islamic law, rather than as exceptional and marginal experiences. A Muslim imaginary in which Muslim refers every part as much to Muslim woman as it does to Muslim man.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rahman. Can you all join me in thanking Dr. Rahman for an absolutely fascinating conversation? I'm sort of clapping alone here, but that's the virtual world. At this point, I would like to open the floor for questions and discussion. Could I ask Dr. Rassi to turn the recording off at this point? Okay, I can see some more